Let's get started, and let's get started for the missions. Carlos was telling us earlier on how he tried to rock the boat on research and innovation in Europe. And I think, Carlos, you're particularly proud of the European Innovation Council, and I can tell you rightly so. But I think where you probably will have rocked the boat most is on missions. And this session is really very much about these famous 5 mission areas on which so many of you are now working, and are so curious to see what these missions really can be about, what they will bring, where they come from. And when Carlos decided that he would be bold on how research and innovation feeds into public policies, he teamed up, because Carlos teams up, with Mariana Mazzucato. Mariana, I don't think I need to introduce you much, but just to say that Mariana is, of course, an extremely well-renowned economist, notably on the public, on the entrepreneurial state and on innovation policy. Very much an inspiration for many, I can tell you, including many in my teams and myself, Mariana. And very much supported and helped our own thinking and Carlos's vision in bringing forward these missions. Now, this is a really very full room, and that reflects, I think, the 2,100 people, Carlos, which wanted to be on the mission boards. 2,100. 75 of you are on the mission boards, and we have a few mission board chairs. Welcome. This really shows how much interest there is in Europe, and the purpose now of the session is to hear Carlos and Mariana tell us a bit more what the missions are, how you see them, and then we will open up, if you agree, also a little bit to the audience to hear how our partners are seeing the missions. But Carlos, maybe you can tell us a bit first why we're there.
So, thank you so much, Jean-Eric, and thank you so much, Mariana, for being here. It's always a pleasure. I was trying to think about when this idea of the missions came to us and how it happened, and just to tell you the story. I think that for me as a Portuguese person, it was always there. I mean, Henry the Navigator, Magellan, and historically they were really the first to imagine science as a mission. There's a beautiful letter from one old director of NASA that basically describes Henry the Navigator as the first man that created a mission-oriented institution, because he was able to put together basically the scientists with the navigators. So it was on that mission. If you look at Magellan, when Magellan goes to the Spanish king and says, look, I'm upset with the Portuguese, I want to get you in a program that you'll get more stuff from India, you'll get a new way to get there. For him, was about science, was not just about the species and get things back to Europe. And so I had that a little bit on the back of my mind, and I understood very soon that we had to do something, but it was not there. It was just like on the back of my mind. And then one day I come across this great book, The Entrepreneurial State, from these economists called Mariana Mazzucato, that I didn't know anything about it. And she was there describing what was on the back of my mind, but I could not really verbalize. And that's where I said, look, I have to find a way to get in touch, and she has to help us. And that was exactly what happened. I mean, Mariana, every 3 words, she would say, mission. And that was so good for us when we started, because we were like talking to the ministers. We wanted to get the idea out, but we needed someone to structure that idea to a level that we could structure the way we act. And so I think that the first meetings were exactly about it. And then Mariana got extremely involved in these, and she was wonderful because she was able to give it to us in a way that I've never seen before. She engaged with the European Union. She was there talking with everybody, and I wanted to really to thank you for that. So for me, the missions were exactly about that I talked at the beginning, of communicating in a different way, in getting people excited, and especially to get people like at the times of Henry the Navigator to say, look, we are proud of what the scientists are doing. And if people are proud of us, then we will have more funding. And with more funding, we'll do more things. And so this was a little bit, Jean-Ric, just at the beginning to give like a context to the story. And then Mariana can tell the second part of the story.
So for me, it's been an absolute honor to work with someone as visionary as Carlos, because it's easy to, if you want, talk about things and new types of policies, but to not many high-level politicians and policymakers are then willing to really get their hands dirty and to ask difficult questions. And I think what I've enjoyed greatly in working with Carlos's entire team is, has been unpicking what exactly does a mission-oriented approach mean for the Commission. In some ways, for me at least, it's not just about innovation policy. It's how do we do capitalism differently? What does an outcomes-based economy look like? And so these two reports that we very much, wrote together, it was a massive amount of teamwork. The first one was really kind of putting out the framework, and I'm sure you're all so well versed in it now. Now you begin with the challenge, and we have the SDGs. We really should not rethink that. We have global agreement that those 17 goals are important, but turning them into concrete missions that can get lots of different sectors to interact together on, that's really key. To go away from a sector approach or even approach based on the size of a company, this idea that SMEs, just because they're small, require support, or a particular type of technology. So again, a problem that gets lots of different actors, sectors, and disciplines interacting and collaborating in new ways. And the really fundamental thing that we tackled in that second report, Governing Missions, is how do you then redesign how governments operate, both transnational entities like the European Commission, but also at the member state level, the tools that governments have at their disposal, from procurement policy, so government as purchaser, from how we design grants and loans, or countries, for example, that have public banks, say the KfW or the Cassa Depositi e Prestiti in Italy, how do they themselves become more mission-oriented? And instead of just becoming, entities that give out subsidies and handouts and guarantees, in Italian we say una pioggia di sussidi, when it rains subsidies, which creates sort of a parasitic public-private partnership. How do you transform these very institutions to drive that bottom-up experimentation at that project level? Getting to the moon required, hundreds of homework problems, of which many failed. So also this question of organizational redesign in terms of risk-taking, welcoming uncertainty, welcoming experimentation and exploration. And then the big question is also things like, well, how are we going to evaluate that process? Mm-hmm. You go to any government, especially in the Treasury, which, we all like to complain that all the problems are in the Treasury or the Ministries of Finance, they currently have manuals of how you evaluate a public investment. So what we did in this second report, again, with so much teamwork, conversations, and debates with Carlos's team, was, well, how might we then evaluate missions in a different way that really captures these dynamic spillovers? Again, along the way to the moon, by chance, lots of things happened, of which many are inside your smartphones. How do we evaluate those dynamic spillovers? Because currently, those manuals are full of static metrics, net present value calculations, cost-benefit analysis. They might be helpful for incremental stuff, but if you want to transform an economy, if we want to have a Europe that is driven by a mission-oriented approach, what might be new types of metrics that really capture that market co-creation process, not just market fixing?
Carlos, can I come back to the mission areas? There's one thing we struggled with, is when you told us, I want mission areas, but I don't think we should set the mission objective at the outset. Your teams in DG Research and Innovation had plenty of great ideas, but they held back. But why did you want that? And how do you see now the process of the mission boards getting us to the mission objective?
So the point, I know that today I sound a little bit like too much pro-European, but I sound like that because I really think that we have to have reasons of being proud of ourselves. And it's not about kind of like we are the best and this like kind of a nationalistic approach to us, but we need that and we need these missions for that. And so when we started, I said, look, the missions have to be something very simple. If there is a comma, there's not a mission. A mission is something that I tell people and people understand immediately. But I don't want to be myself or the public servants to tell you what the mission are. We want to co-create those missions with you. And this is the most difficult political exercise of the next 10 years for politicians. Because I think that people, and now I'm not talking just science, I'm talking about in general, people are tired of politics because people find that they're not participating in politics. And so the first kind of wave of involving people was just to do, let's do public consultations. But that is not really co-creating with people. And I wanted to also to leave for the future, and that's where Jean-Enrique has been paramount, something different. And that was about co-creating those missions together with the people. And the missions were about choosing these areas that come like the Sustainable Development Goals, the challenges, and now we have these areas, but now we have to transform these areas in something very easy for people to understand. And when we go always back, and Mariana goes like me always back to the moonshot, it's because the way that was set up was so simple. The language was so simple. So when we say mission and cancer, I mean, we have to really develop something that people understand what we're going to do. Because if not, it's not a mission. And I feel that we are on the right track now with the mission board. Because the mission boards are basically made of very diverse people. Then we have these assemblies, which will have even more diverse people around the mission boards, and that together we can define these very simple ideas. And so I don't want to tell you what I think, but when I look at cancer, and knowing that Nixon said we will cure cancer, and today that doesn't make sense, what can we do for people to say, I understand what they're doing? What are we going to do about cancer? And I think that this is the responsibility. We have here two of the chairs, at least in front of me, for two of the very important missions. One on the soil, the Minister Virman, Kees Virman here, and Mayor Hannah Gronkovich-Waltz that is here with us. And your mission as chairs will be exactly there. How do you co-create? So I think that I've asked you something very difficult. Mm-hmm. It's really difficult. But if you are successful, then we are successful. But one thing I know, if we would have defined the missions ourselves and tell everybody this is the mission, that would not have the buy-in of the people. Yeah. And for me, that is extremely important on this vision.
So an exercise in deliberative democracy, including to capture back the imagination of the public, is how you were always saying it, for support for science, but probably also for European policy making, I would say. Maya, do you think we can do that as European officials supported by these mission boards, travel across all member states and really get the feedback from people in? How do we do that?
Well, first of all, I don't think we have a choice. We have to. But I think this word, the people, sometimes is confusing. And I think it's really important, and maybe this is, again, the next phase. In fact, in the Governing Missions report, the second one, we broke it down into three, of which one was citizen engagement. And it's really, as exactly as you say, Carlos, citizen engagement is the hardest bit. It's we actually don't have capacity in that. Yeah. In the Masters in Public Administration, there's no Empathy 101 kind of class. We don't necessarily know how to listen. There's an art of listening. We need to learn that. But just coming to the word people, there's organizations. I mean, let me just give you an example of one, trade unions or organizations that have, for a century now, been in many times in capitalist history, actually on the frontier of fighting for change. We wouldn't have weekends. We wouldn't have the 8-hour workday without trade unions. Not a bad thing. And I actually regret that we didn't have the word labor anywhere in this one. So in the next revised edition, let's put it in, because I think it's very important what you say when you say that people are disillusioned. And it's not disillusioned only because they didn't take part, but also because they didn't benefit. there has also often been public investment, but not necessarily, if you want, a public return. And I'm not just thinking of a monetary return, a return to really make sure that the way we govern the system really benefits citizens. The most obvious example would be the health area, massive amount of public money. In the US, for example, $39 billion a year of taxpayer funds go to funding health innovation, and somehow the prices of the drugs don't reflect that. I won't go into the details, but that's just an example of why it's really important to have a mission-oriented approach, not just in terms of the missions themselves, but really look at the whole system and how it's working on both supply and demand. But currently, what's interesting is the trade union movement is talking about this very interesting dynamic concept, which is the just transition. When we transit away from a dirty economy towards a clean one, so a green economy and hopefully a Green New Deal, it's a wonderful concept, there will in fact be many workers who are left behind if they're not invested in because they had capacity and skills perhaps in the browner industries. And the concept of the just transition, I think it's very good, but it's reactive. You wait for someone else to define the transition, and then you make sure that workers don't get left behind. I think if we really want to do what you have set out as being an important kind of co-creation process, this would be an example where we need to make sure the trade unions, at least some representatives, are at the table ex ante, not just ex post. Yeah, this is the provocation in some ways of talking about missions being co-created, and we don't necessarily know how to do that. Having said that, if I can also say something very positive about Europe, is we have a variety of capitalism that is not the same as the sort of more neoliberal, purely maximizing shareholder value kind of capitalism that exists in the United States. We also don't have the Chinese version. We have a variety of different ways to do capitalism, which itself can help us in thinking about how to bring different actors to the table to co-create missions. I'm thinking specifically about Scandinavia and some of the Nordic countries that have had this concept of stakeholder capitalism, where they have, workers, government, the industry at the table together, thinking about the future of a sector. Let's learn from that. That's what the European way should be, not kind of shoving down the throat of countries a number like 3% deficit, but really learning what works, what doesn't, what can we learn from the German system, what worked in Italy in a particular period, what can we learn from this stakeholder governance, and bring those lessons to the missions approach. So we really do capitalism in a better way.
Carlos, did you realize we were changing capitalism and the economy as we were engaging on missions?
I don't feel, I think, I hope that we are contributing at least to the way that politics is done. And if we don't do that collectively, at some point, these will go all down the drain. I mean, our system. And I see that as a politician. I mean, I go to my country, you talk to people, and then people in the street come to you and say, look, I don't agree what we do. I want to participate. Why don't you ask me? And you say, look, the digital world is transforming the way we deal with politics. And so we have to give that step. And that step has to be done with people like us, because I think science and innovation will be the house for doing those experiments. So I feel that we are experimenting, but as Mariana said, we don't have an answer. I mean, we don't have an answer yet.
Yeah. No, we need clearly a new economy, and research and innovation feeds into that discussion, and the missions are an experiment exactly in that.
So you're absolutely right. It's doing politics differently, but if we take missions seriously, it's about doing economic growth differently.
Yeah.
And this is the challenge. It has to go out of your commission and now Maria Grayburl's to the center also, not only, also of ECFIN.
Yes.
It really has, if we want innovation-led growth, the first thing is to recognize that innovation has not just a rate, but a direction. It always has. Even when we deregulate the financial sector, that gives it a direction, right? So really what missions do is it becomes a much more explicit, potentially transparent, dynamic, interesting, participatory process for setting that direction. But the direction's already being set, often in problematic ways. And I think by again, talking about a new type of economy and a new type of directed growth, it allows us also then to transform lots of types of economic policies. We've been working through the institute I run at UCL with different governments on transforming industrial strategy away from just a list of sectors. In the UK, they had 5: life sciences, aerospace, automobiles, creative industries, and financial services. And we said, take away the list. It's not a list of sectors. What are the key problems around the future of mobility, healthy aging, clean growth? Turn those into missions that all your sectors, it's the same approach, have to tackle, but call that the type of industrial strategy you will do. And all of a sudden, instead of just bailing out the steel sector, or now this tourism group that's about, or I think it has gone under, the question is also, how does the sector itself transform itself, instead of just asking to be bailed out or asking for a subsidy, to meet a societal objective, which is framed as missions. Yeah. In Germany, a very interesting example was steel, when it had to lower its material content in order to get some loans, because of the Energiewende policy. You know, so you don't just support steel, you support its transformation for public purpose and public goal.
This is research and innovation as a compass for the future we want in reality. This is very much, I think, Carlos, your policy and also Horizon Europe, but particularly indeed impactful potentially in these missions. Maybe one word on the research and innovation agenda. So the first step will be that you will define the objective of the missions. You will come back to us as boards and recommend a concrete objective, if you want a European common good, really, in these 5 areas. And then there will be a research innovation agenda, which needs to be set out to underpin it and enable it. Carlos, I mean, what's your ambition on that, if you can leave us with this guidance?
I think that the missions will somehow be the drivers of where we want to go in these 5 areas. And that will have the spillover effects of first getting the politicians in Europe to putting more money in science and innovation. And then we can get our direction right and our rate, as you say, Mariana, very well. And I think that we in Europe, somehow after the crisis of 2008, what happened is that the direction was just a result of a discussion around the table where everybody at the end was so tired that the direction was taken without really thinking through that direction. And one thing I'm sure is that whatever it takes for the future of Europe, the direction of investing more in research and innovation is paramount. And that is the direction. And then to get that, the missions will be the driver to get people excited about it. Because I tell you one thing, I feel that, of course, in a room like this, everybody is very excited. But when I walk in the streets of Madrid or Lisbon or Paris, and people look at me and say, so what do you do? Oh, I'm in the European Union. And first, people don't even know what's the Commission or the Parliament or the Council. And second, you tell them about the European program of science, and they kind of look at you and say, do you do that? But what are you doing there? And that's the next step, this communication with the people and involving the people that we've been talking through. Without that, there's no direction. And this is something that I hope, and I'm really happy to see that the President-elect Ursula von der Leyen, she immediately she gave that direction. I mean, she gave that direction on the Green Deal. She gave that direction talking about cancer. So she's telling people that this is not a direction of research and innovation, but it's a direction of Europe. And so as I was discussing with Mariana, I think that we have to be able, and I think that Maria Gabriel will be able to do that, and we've talked about it, like to go up from the level that we are today, which is the level of fighting, to a level where everybody is talking about it. And I believe that I did my work around the table. I've put everyone talking about it in the commission, in the college, and now we have to keep doing that, and this has to be the direction for our future, Jean-Eric. Yeah. Without that, I think that we'll get in more trouble. Europe is at a point that the decision, it's really the tipping point, if you want. I think we talk a lot of Malcolm Gladwell book of the tipping point, and is exactly that. We are at a tipping point. If we don't do it, then we'll not catch this amazing opportunity that we have ahead of us.
Yeah. Maya, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting when we consider the budget, too, the amount of money that will be available for the missions.
Yeah.
And it's not small, but it's also not massive, you know, compared to, say, European GDP. But that's why it's so important for it to be structured, as you say, Carlos, to be as inspirational as possible, to really then crowd in other forms of investment. Because this is how I first got interested in the concept of missions. And I ran a conference, I think back in 2013, where I brought together different types of mission-oriented organizations around the world. And I asked them, how do you do what you do? So, for example, ARPA-E, that had just recently been formed. And they, said, well, we actually measure our success by how much risk we were willing to take and how much economy-wide impact we have. And the success of these organizations was very much down to the way that they then excited or increased the expectations about new opportunities in the business community. And we've just recently done some initial empirical studies. I was just talking to you about this in the coffee break, asking, is the multiplier larger? You know, the classic multiplier where you look at the effect on GDP of every euro spent. Is it larger when you have a mission-oriented investment? So same amount of money, 1 billion here, 1 billion there. Here it's just kind of bridges, roads, some science, some schools, some university financing, et cetera. Here, similar kinds of categories, but with a goal for transforming a society in a particular direction. And it's 4 or 5 times as large. I mean, the study, I won't bore you with the technical details, but we needed a long time series, so we had to use some military funds, because when you want to fight the war, you by definition have to invest in lots of different areas. And there's very little knowledge in the macroeconomy field about multipliers for mission-oriented financing. But the big point here is that what drives business investment is not a tax credit, an R&D tax credit, or a patent box kind of policy. It really is this perception of where the future growth and technological opportunities are. So what's really important at this phase in setting up the mission boards, and you have your leaders, and there's going to be a whole co-creation process, is to also really make sure that the tools in place, especially those that are supposed to be, in our mission diagrams, crowding in that bottom-up experimentation, are really thought through and redesigned also at the member state level to maximize that crowding in effect.
Yeah. And when we were talking, thinking about also the change that we need in leadership, right? Because if you look at, for a mission to work, you have also to have the alignment of the public service. And the alignment of the public service is that the Director General or the Commissioner or whoever is the responsible gives the freedom to the people in the organization to take those risks. And that is something that the public sector, and Mariana has worked a lot on that, has to work very, very much. And so the mission board's invention is to steer that, to be able to somehow force also the public servants to take those risks, because you're backing them. You're telling them, we as the mission boards, we're telling you, take the risk. And then people feel better at taking that risk. And I think that it goes from the time where people used to have these visionary leaders, politicians that will tell you what to do. Now people want to have a different kind of politicians. They want to really be co-creating that future with the politician, and so you need a different type. And it's very interesting because you see that also on the leadership of the big companies. I mean, if you compare the leaders like Bill Gates, like today with Tim Cook, it's a very different kind of people. Steve Jobs, and today the leaders of the companies, they are actually changing to be more on that mood, which is to be more on the background, to let people take the risks. And that is one of our challenges, and we know it is, I mean, internally. Yeah. But I think this is a challenge that we can be the driver for the national systems and for the countries also to change. Because I tell you as an experience, I mean, I worked in the Portuguese government and I've worked in the Commission. And so I think that the way the Commission and the European Union does it's an influencer in the way that public servants at the national level work. And so you, the ones that work at DGRTD and all the DGs that are here all represented, you have that responsibility of being the influencers for that. So it's a big, you know, I'm as you know, I'm very proud of the EIC story and the missions. And I mean, the missions really go beyond all these, and I think that we can take that challenge and change the system, but it will take a long time. I mean, I've done 5 years. I think Maria will do very well, and then there will be another commissioner coming, and then we'll come back to see if it works.
The DG will still be there to support that.
You'll still be there.
No, the DG, I said the DG. Can I maybe now say just one last point before I open also to possible comments and questions? So the research and innovation agenda, hopefully exciting enough to really crowd in member state, industry, other parts also of Horizon Europe and other parts of the EU budget. But then I think the real challenge is going to be to use the research results, technology, social innovation, knowledge, and then transform it in, and use it in the public policy toolbox, which you described earlier on, Mariana, and implement the outcome, because it's about an outcome in society. It's not about research. I mean, any advice on how we will have time to work on it, and the mission boards, I think, would be quite challenged on that too, but how do we translate the outcomes of the research agenda and shape the research agenda to an extent as well, taking then fully into account this implementation through the multi-level toolbox of public policy in Europe? That's going to be, I think, really exciting.
Yeah, so I think there's different parts of the question. I'm not sure which one you were sort of highlighting the most, but I think one thing is in doing these missions, it means doing things differently. So it's, you know, we currently in Europe have different instruments like the FETs and the KETs, and there has, of course, been a challenge-oriented approach for quite some time. You know, smart growth, inclusive growth, sustainable growth. So it's not that this is completely new, but actually it is new. So in implementing these missions, there will be lots of lessons, and I think it's fundamental that you invest as a commission, also in-house, in that learning process and that translation process between commissions, but also for the member states and vice versa. Again, I think we've had conversations with your team of what we've been learning in applying this approach to some organizations like public banks or to industrial strategy, and what are the lessons for the Commission. But just one quick thing. I met today with Maria Gabriel, your successor, and one thing I loved that she said, because I asked her also about the new name of the Commission, we didn't really talk actually about a key thing, which is why is the name research no longer there, and hopefully it'll come back. But I really liked what she said about youth, because I didn't really understand what that was going to be about. And it was very much about actually what you were just talking about in terms of risk-taking. She believes, in the same way that I often say, the state needs to take risks, and that kind of, you know, portfolio approach and welcoming uncertainty needs to be something inside the public service. She was arguing that the youth of today in Europe are not nurtured to welcome, you know, risk-taking, trial and error and error and error. They really fear making mistakes, both at the educational level, but also in terms of the culture, perhaps. And so it'd be very interesting, actually, if there could be some overriding sort of big cultural shift on both the public service, but also in how we train our young in terms of really becoming a European Union of experimentation. And it's not risk-taking for the sake of risk-taking. That's kind of the venture capital kind of, you know, myth of, oh, take risks for the sake of risks. That's not the point. The point is, in order to really tackle any of these goals in the missions, it's going to only be able to occur if we experiment and learn along the way. But learning from failure is just as important as being willing to fail. And I've noticed that in many public organizations, they have, you know, they maybe don't want to take the risks, and for all the reasons that we know, but even when they do, and maybe they fail, they either hide it or they don't learn from it. And learning requires investment in-house. And what I see across Europe, unfortunately, is a massive outsourcing of capacity and capabilities from basically from the state, whether it's to the consulting companies, you know, PricewaterhouseCoopers et al., whether it's to, you know, the think tanks. And I think this really should be a call to arms to say, hey, let's really tackle these big problems with the full capacity of our research base, but also, as you say, learning along the way of what it requires inside these public institutions and invest in those capabilities. And that requires a reversal of what we currently see.
So the mission boards, you will help us to learn. And indeed, I think no pressure on the mission boards. It will be very different across the 5 areas. It will be, I think, very different also across member states, with some being really keen to take it on, others finding it for reasons which can be of a different nature more difficult. And we need to learn from that as we go. Can I open to the floor? I'm not sure this is a good idea. I don't see anything, but I'm sure someone will help me. I have already a first question in the front, in the middle, the lady in the second row. If you could very briefly introduce yourself, that would be appreciated.
Good afternoon, Doris Alexander, Trinity College Dublin. Thank you very much for your inspiring, speech around missions. The question I had in terms of crowdfunding in other sources of funding rather than just Horizon Europe, and I think as you've said, Mariana, the amount of funding available for missions is not huge. In fact, if you look at the Apollo mission and bring that forward in terms of today's terms, it's not huge at all. So we absolutely have to have other sources of funding. To what extent are member states in Europe being incentivised or encouraged or willing to step up to provide some of that other source of public funding, aside from private funding as well? But to what extent are member states encouraged to be part of the process? Thank you.
Carlos, do you want to?
I can start. I think that your question is really crucial, because if the member states are not involved, if this is seen as just a mission of the European Commission, and that's why I say a mission from the European Union and not the European Commission, then we cannot get there. And I think that if you go historically to the role of RTD and research and innovation, we were those influencers. Look at, for instance, the ERC. The ERC is now influencing a lot of countries. I mean, I'm thinking of Spain or France, where they just decide to look at our filter, the way that we look into the projects in the ERC, and use that filter to fund the projects. So that creates synergies. And so I totally agree with your point. It's not just the private, but it's also at the national governments to align the efforts on these missions. And that's why the missions have to be crystal clear, right? If I say that my mission in cancer is that in 10 years nobody dies from cancer, then I can engage better the national governments that will have to tell the story to their constituents that yes, I mean, we want to align our efforts here in the country with this because this is important. And so that's the challenge that we have ahead of us. But yes, if we don't achieve what you said, then I think that we don't achieve the result of having a truly European mission. And that's a little bit what the difficulty of communicating in Europe is that if in 5 years people in the different countries don't know about the missions, then it's because the national governments are not really there. And so it's probably our fault and their fault, but we will have to go back to that. So that will be what I think is...
Yeah, don't add anything?
I would just add that was exactly, well, that has to happen, but especially in terms of the design of the instruments at the member state level. So I gave the example before of the public banks. You can have one public bank that literally just hands out money to a sector or firm that asks for it, and another one who really sees its role in terms of transformation towards some goals. And so it's about picking the willing, not picking the winners. And you could say the same thing in terms of different types of loans and guarantees. And the European Investment Bank itself, the kind of leveraging effect that it can have and that crowding in effect it can have is so much higher if itself becomes, learns, if you want, about the capacity of these missions to affect the multiplier. And it's not easy, and so many of our economic tools are currently not designed that way. And there's also lots of indirect tools that cost member states a lot of money. So if you have an ineffective R&D tax credit or some sort of indirect mechanism which is just focused on this assumption that you can just reduce tax and investment will increase, that reduces the public budget. It reduces the taxation that's coming into the public sector. And then it makes it think it can do less. So it's really important to think if it's going to be more about direct versus indirect, or at least and then redesign that direct funding instead of being kind of the classical vertical approach, which is kind of handing out to particular categories. That's the opportunity to transform the concept of vertical approaches, not as handouts, but to be problem-oriented.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I mean, I must say I'm rather optimistic for one reason, which is that the delivery of the missions need to take place in the national systems as well. So by construction, this is a joint effort. But let's hope that indeed the missions are so exciting, as you hope for, Carlos, that everybody indeed will rally around them, including for the investment in the research and innovation part of those missions. Who's coming in now? Yes.
Hello, this is Diana Russo. I'm the Executive Director of Spheric Accelerator, which is the top tech startup accelerator in Romania, and the founding member of the CE network supporting the innovative entrepreneurship. Which was, by the way, an initiative supported by Commissioner Maria Gabriel, so we are really excited to continue our work with her. I was wondering if part of the process of the implementation, because I see the missions as really inspiring as an idea. So when we work with a startup, you take an idea and then you go through the dreadful execution process, which kind of makes or breaks everything. And I was wondering if have you thought about accelerators as mainly good allies to different institutions in order to kind of have this kind of mid-level, because they can help a lot in cultural shift and also in learning by doing, and also giving them a new mission and decoupling most accelerator from only VC and give them like an extensive mission across the society. Thank you.
Okay. Carlos, I think that was for you.
Look, I think that when we talked about the system, and so let me go a little bit of a level up. With Mariana, we talked a lot about how to create this ecosystem. And the ecosystem was top-down and bottom-up. And the top-down part of our ecosystem is to have these missions where you give direction. But then you have to have the bottom-up, which is the European Innovation Council, where you give freedom and where you have people working in an interdisciplinary way towards that kind of mission. And so it's a little bit of the two working together. Because if you look at the different systems, and I looked at the different systems in the world, sometimes or they are too top-down, or sometimes they're just bottom-up. And I think that what we wanted to create in Horizon Europe was kind of the right mix in between top-down to give direction and bottom-up to create the conditions for people to discover, to try, to experiment in between the different disciplines. And so that's the way we see the system working, and that's the way I think it will work better. As Mariana, she has this idea of giving the direction, and I think that is extremely important. You have to give this direction, and the tax credits is a great example, because if you just do the tax credit without giving direction, people just go all over. And you have to tell people, where do you want to go? And where Europe wants to go. And then you leave them the freedom to work with their startup accelerators, with their science, and work together as a team. So that's the way I see the ecosystem. I don't know if I went really to the question, but I think that's what I understood you were asking. But if there's something more specific, please tell me.
Mariana, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said exactly the right thing by beginning with this concept of innovation systems. And often these systems, we think that, you can just fund a lot of science and then put in some venture capital and somehow it will lead to commercialization. But at each step of the way, big mistakes can be made, both in terms of not actually having a systems approach, just doing sort of one bit of the system and thinking that the rest doesn't matter, but also, for example, how you structure the venture capital system itself really matters. So the biotechnology sector has really been disadvantaged from having been flooded with exit-driven finance, finance from the venture capital community that wanted to exit in 3 years. So all these PLIPOs, productless IPOs, so exiting through an IPO or a buyout, we should learn from those mistakes. So what kind of patient long-term finance can most benefit startups in order to scale up and actually produce something of use, even regardless of the missions concept? And I think there also it's interesting to see that, the DARPA type organization in the US, which is your classic mission-oriented organization, right? Because it's not just about policies. Organizations have to be, rethought and restructured potentially, and the DARPA model is always one out there that people look at. It wouldn't have had no effect without procurement. So, it was financing in such a way that then there was also a market, and government as purchaser then allowed those small companies that got involved with the DARPA financing to scale up actually quite fast. And I'm always curious when people say in Europe, oh, this is terrible, we invest in all these great companies, and then they all go off to the US, as though there's like this Hoover kind of sucking them up. If you break down what's interesting in the US, it's actually a system of innovation. Currently, by the way, it's being dismantled for the first time in US history. Ronald Reagan actually increased the funding, just to say Reagan because it's not a party thing. Ronald Reagan increased the funding for lots of these mission-oriented organizations. But anyway, up until now, the innovation system in the US has really benefited a lot of startups in that kind of scaling up process. And anyway, so when you talk about accelerators, it's very important to immediately start with this concept of systems. And then also in terms of the European approach, how you've always framed it with the ERC, kind of blue sky thinking on the research level, the EIC, blue sky thinking at the firm level, then these missions to really create inspiration that can create really not just mission-oriented, if you want, finance, but interesting conversations even between the basic research and the applied research.
Exactly.
I think there's such an interesting way to really also build that further into a very unique European system of innovation.
Yeah. I suppose that nothing prevents us, if so justified, to use the European Innovation Council, also to give it some direction, if that is needed to deliver on the missions. We were innovative in starting on time. I think we also will be a bit innovative in finishing early, because we need to finish in the next couple of minutes. So can I take maybe one last intervention, if I have one, in the back with the red hand? I think a lady's hand, yeah. Yeah, exactly. No, it was you. Yeah. If the micro can come to you. Sorry for colleagues on right and left, but it's easier in the center.
Thank you. It is the dress, probably. I have a question for Carlos, because I work in citizen science, public engagement, and social innovation. And you mentioned that public consultations are not what you are thinking when you mention co-creation and public engagement. So my question is, given the fact that the Science with and for Society program is out, I think, of Horizon Europe, how do you envisage to embed the co-creation processes into the missions? And if you can give some examples about it. Thank you.
Okay. No, very good. I was just explaining my own personal experience as a politician, that I think that the public consultation is a first step. It was the first time that politicians decided, let's involve citizens. And so if you ask someone if they want in their neighborhood a road or a roundabout, you basically just telling them vote for one or vote for another. That is very different from saying, let's sit down with the citizens, or at least with the representatives from the citizens, and say, do we really need the roundabout, or do we really need the road? And probably you'll get to a very different outcome. And I think the mission boards and the mission assemblies are a little bit the engine of that, where you're sitting people and saying, look, we want, and we're going to look at soils, or looking at cancer, or the oceans, or the cities. What do we really want? Let's build it together. And so I think that in Horizon Europe and in the other programs, we will have to redesign also the way we do citizens engagement based on what we're going to do on the missions. And I hope really that we are successful. I'm really betting on that. And I want to sell these to my colleagues because this is not just about the missions. I mean, this engagement is extremely important. There was one point that Mariana was mentioning about the public procurement. And, you know, if you look at the GDP of Europe, which is around 14 trillion euros, if you look at the public procurement in Europe yearly, it's about 2 trillion. So we have a huge weapon to attract more innovation by using this 14% of the GDP of Europe if we give direction. Again, exactly. But today we don't have that direction. So I mean, how do you can involve public procurement through the engagement of the cities and the people in the different member states?
Yeah. Carlos, thank you very much. Can I ask both of you to close? If you could leave us and leave the mission board chairs and their members and the assemblies with maybe one piece of advice, one thing which would help them in starting their impossible mission. Carlos or Mariana. Mariana, maybe you start and then Carlos?
No,
very good.
I don't. I just. Was looking to my notes before coming, looking at Henry the Navigator, and then I kind of reread for my 1,000th time the moonshot speech of Kennedy, and I mean this sentence when he says comes to my mind today to tell you. I mean, he says we chose to go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And I think that this is hard. This is difficult because no one did it before. I think that Mariana has the experience of looking into the countries and working with the UK government and so many other governments and even with the US now. But this is at a totally different level, at the European Union level. So I really wish every one of you, and more specifically to the mission boards, Minister and Mayor, you're in charge, that you will be able to don't let down, don't give up. I mean, there will be difficult times, it will be difficult to get the result we want, but don't give up. Don't give up and keep doing it. So do you agree with that, Mariana?
Definitely.
Yeah.
I would add to that sort of 3 quick advices. 1, don't allow the concept of missions to be captured, to be describing what's already being done, and now we all of a sudden use the word missions to describe that. 2, to actually look at what has been done, because it's not all to be thrown out, but you know, it's not as though we're the first to talk about, you know, clean oceans and clean growth and cancer. What exactly was going wrong? What was, you know, where were the bottlenecks in terms of, again, the design of the system, but also the instruments, the interactions between public and private? So to do a bit of a anatomy, taxonomy and anatomy of existing ways. And 3rd, just bring it to a higher level. I really think if we want to have, and we shouldn't abandon those challenges above the missions, right? Again, smart growth, sustainable growth, inclusive growth. If we're going to use the missions to really drive Europe to have a form of growth that really tries at least to benefit as most people as possible, it has to be discussed at the highest levels, both in member states and in the Commission. It cannot be relegated just to innovation policy or R&D policy.
Absolutely.
It has to be talked about inside ECFIN. So make sure that once a month you speak to the people in ECFIN. Because otherwise we continue to have these myths about economic growth, which I remember some years ago translated into about 40% cuts to the R&D system in Spain in order to meet the targets of the deficit. And if you look at deficit ratios across Europe, you know, Italy, for example, has had a lower deficit than Germany for about 20 years, but a much higher debt to GDP, precisely because it hasn't been investing on both public and private in the key areas that drive long-term growth. And yet, unfortunately, if I can be a bit provocative, you continue to hear, also in the European Commission, and other places, this constant kind of, when we look at the periphery to Greece, to Italy, this concept of just the deficit. So make sure that the lessons you're learning of the importance of innovation, the importance of research for long-term growth, and the inspirational ways to make that crowd in other actors gets learned by the gurus on the top that continue, however, sorry to be so provocative, to come out with these random numbers, 3%, 0%, 1%, 2%. Let's get our hands dirty with the real experiences across Europe to make sure that we get the missions to work well.
Yeah,
It's a new narrative.
the discussion is started, is taking place. Thank you very much to both of you. So the missions now got started. The mission boards will work with you throughout tomorrow in the program. There are 5 meetings. Each mission board will be working with all of you throughout the day tomorrow, and they are available in the village today, tomorrow, Thursday. Help them to get started. Thank you very much.